There it goes.
Yeah.
Okay. All right, so for the sake of the folks that are on Zoom, our little microphones are Bluetooth. This is our wrench. This is what we use to hold our microphone. So this is going to sit on a table right here. This should capture audio from folks that ask questions. I will let folks know that are on Zoom. If you cannot hear the questions, please let us know. We'll try to do our best to record or to repeat ourselves so that those come through properly. And with that, I think we should be good to go. All right. So a little bit about myself. My name is Floyd. I'm the Recruitment and Development Coordinator here at the Kenai Chamber of Commerce. My background is business and design. I received an interdisciplinary studies from the University of Alaska Fairbanks about a year and a half ago. That was about an 8-year journey to get that undergrad, and some really rough advising at UAA for the first 3 years, and then I decided to transfer to their online program during the pandemic. So my background in design ranges all the way from two-dimensional design to 3D design, video editing, 3D animation, technical design and drafting. So a large range of stuff. The longest that I've been doing is graphic design for about 8 to 10 years. Oh boy. All right.
Technical difficulties.
You know what it is? It may be that disconnected?
Well, when I closed this, it closed that.
Oh.
Sorry. Technology. That's why he does the technology ones, which is funny because I'm doing the back office technology part. And then when I do my speech, he takes care of all this, and then we never have a glitch. It's actually
okay.
a problem.
Let's see. Let's try that. Okay. So there is, all right, so that should be in.
And I'm gonna go in my office.
Okay, sounds good.
Can't mess anything up.
Awesome. I don't have that turned on to receive audio, so you'll just have to join the audio. If you have issues, let me know. Okay, I'm gonna fix our camera as well because it's a little goofy where it's at. All right, so a lot of history in graphic design, a lot of history in art in general. But so today we're going to focus on graphic design, and then maybe on later down the road, if there's interest for other art fields such as video editing, production, whatever, we may get into that as well. So the plan for today is to talk about the principles of graphic design, which is going to be the biggest chunk of what we talk about today. So that is going to be about 9 different segments of things to consider when creating different design elements. I will have the slide deck sent out via email after we're done today. So if you can take pictures if you want to. Sometime, I believe, tomorrow or on Monday, we'll go ahead and get that sent out over email as well. So then we'll jump into best practices, sort of general tips and tricks, and things that are good to know when designing really anything. And then I'm going to talk a little bit about some resources that I'll be sharing later tomorrow or Monday as well. So first thing we're going to talk about, sort of understanding the basics. So there are 2 types of graphic elements that are used commonly between when you're doing designs, and they have different uses. So the first one is a raster image, which is also known as a JPEG or a PNG. These are things that you see almost everywhere. So if you're on social media at all, if you're looking at websites, 99% of what you're looking at is going to be a raster image. So photos your friends share on Facebook, or if you're on a website and they have their logo or photos, 90% of the time it's going to be a raster image. So the 2 big differences between a raster and a vector is what happens when you make them larger. Has anyone ever zoomed in really close to a photo and seen the pixels and how it's sort of chunky? So with a vector image, that does not happen. So your vector images are going to be the ones that are used for logos and any sort of sticker design, anything like that that is going to be expanded. So if you're designing a banner, you either want that, if you're doing it as a raster, you want the resolution to be extremely high to avoid that increased resolution where it's pixelated and chunky, or you want it to be a vector, which allows for scalability with 0 pixelization. So we may talk a little bit more about that later today, but those are just 2 very, very common terms that will be used in sort of the design world just, as a general rule of thumb, raster is not typically good for scaling. Vector is perfect for scaling. So depending on your use case, what you're using may change. So next, we're going to talk a little bit about fonts. So fonts seem like a pretty simple thing. There is a lot of depth to fonts. There's a lot of different uses to fonts, and they can really be the backbone that helps create a cohesive design. So the most common two fonts are serif and sans serif fonts. We'll get into the differences between those two a little bit later. But the other two types that are very common are script type. Script type has a very heavy foundation in calligraphy and handwritten text. Most typography stems from the script at their very roots as well. And then the last type is display type. It's also known as a decorative type. These can be wildcards really wherever you find them. They are typically designed by hand specifically for one purpose or one theme. So this larger, chunky, pixelated theme of this bottom display type, you typically wouldn't put at the top of maybe a header that you're putting on a memo or a flyer to the community, unless it's something like, let's say, one of our upcoming movie nights here where we're playing a movie that has heavy pop culture references, heavy video game references, and something where that fits. So looking at the serif and the sans serif, the big difference are these little chunks and strokes that come off of the letters themselves. These are actually called serifs. So if you can use the power of deduction, you see there's serif and sans serif. Sans means without or not. So those are two very common styles. You'll typically see serifs in a lot more elegant typography, a lot more professional typography. Things like Times New Roman is a very common serif font. Helvetica is another common one. And then sans serif, you'll see things like Arial or Calibri, which are typically the defaults when you're using Microsoft Word or a lot of other softwares like that. So there is one font that I want to talk about specifically that is, if you ask any graphic designer what their least favorite font is, they will say Comic Sans. The reason this is not a very liked font is because it has so much variability to it. It looks like it was drawn with a felt marker. It seems very fun, but if you analyze the word itself, if sans is without and comic is the root of comedy, this is without comedy, not fun. However, yes?
You use Comic Sans on the doors.
I was just about to point that out. I did not. I would not have. However,
I think it's awesome.
I was going to say, if you, I was going to point that out. So if you walk out when you're leaving, just take a look at our front door. It says welcome in Comic Sans in a very large lettering, which is the reason I come in the back door when I come to work. Yeah, you got ahead of me, which is, yeah. All right, so those are sort of basic building blocks, general rules of thumb to look at when we're going into our principles. So the principles we're looking at today, we have 9 of them. We'll be looking at balance, contrast, hierarchy, unity, repetition, pattern, rhythm, movement, and variety. As we get through these principles, you will start to notice that a lot of these have overlapping areas. I'm going to do my best to break them down individually, and then as we move forward, pattern are pretty similar, but there is a subtle difference there. So first one we're going to look at is balance. Balance is all about, this can be done in multiple different ways. The most common way is to have objects align on the right-hand side, left-hand side, or center. When you're doing text, there's a balance there. Now you're looking at symmetry. You can say, well, let's look at it diagonally. On the bottom left, you don't have any text, but you've got a large planet that's taking up a lot of space. You've got large text on the top right taking up a lot of space, and you have a balance of the weight. Now, if that Space Museum text was any smaller or any larger, it would start to have a toppling effect. Or if that planet was not on the bottom left, you'd feel a large void, and it would seem uneasy to the eyes. Right there. So now, looking at this, I've removed the clouds in the background. It feels very empty. There's not any life to it. It's very flat. It's so subtle that maybe you didn't even notice it the first time it was up, but as soon as they're gone, you notice instantly. This is a way of creating depth and balance from front to back as if you're looking through a light box that has several different layers and panes to it. This can be achieved with shadows. This can be achieved with extra objects in the background that have a level of blur to them. There's a lot that you can do with these very small, subtle elements. So these asteroids on the top left and bottom right are another example of your angular balance and symmetry. They don't necessarily have to be the same object, but just the space that they're taking up creates a nice balance that feels good when you look at it. And there's, as you start to do more designing, you will do a lot of this by what could be called muscle memory. So when I'm designing something, I'm not necessarily looking at my list of 9 principles and saying, am I hitting every one of these? I'll look at a design and say, that feels wrong, this feels right. And then I can go through my analysis and say, did I hit everything like I wanted to? And if I didn't, then I can go back and readjust. So following balance, next principle that we have is contrast. So contrast is typically talked about when doing photo editing or anything like that. So contrast is often seen as the difference between colors or lights and darks, whereas difference in element size and texture can actually be a form of contrast as well. So you look at this design that's up here, and we have sort of a gradient of color shifting from a red hue to a green hue, and it's on a black background. So that color is, in its sense, the easiest way to achieve contrast. So we have lighter colors on a dark background, contrast instantly achieved. You can also achieve it with textures. So you look at this rough distress texture on the front. This is a t-shirt design that was easily mocked up. And the background is a flat, nice, crisp, no distressing. Same with the text that says retro vibe. No distress texture, you have a contrast there. Next, you can look at your fonts. So the retro vibe says that's a serif font. There's little serifs and little flares that are added off of that. However, the since 1990, you can't really see it because our projector's not the greatest. That's a sans serif font. When you see it on the computer and take a look at these slides afterwards, you'll see it's nice and crisp. So you have 2 different sets of fonts that still create a level of contrast that just make it nice to look at. And then we have our colors. We have our variety of colors that are not conflicting. We do have a few hues of the green and blue towards the bottom that are getting kind of close, but it's a nice gradient from that red down to that green. So contrast. Next, we have hierarchy. This is most commonly used when talking about text. So text is the easiest way to show hierarchy. And you see this a lot of times on websites. So when you look at a website or a blog, or if you're doing research or anything like that, you'll notice that the top heading or the title of your article is going to be the largest. And each time you start a new section, you have a new heading. Whereas you have heading 1, heading 2, heading 3, all those where they scale in size and weight and potentially a font type. So in this case, we see music show, number 1. That's the most important thing to look at. When you look at this, your eyes need to be drawn to what is most important and then go from there. So you start with music show, you then go down and say, well, when is this music show? Well, there's the date. And then every other level of text after that is the same size with variable weights. So you see the website where it says reallyGreatSite.com. That's an important piece of information, but it's not as important as the date or the context of the event. So then everything else would be a secondary or a third level importance. So this can most commonly be achieved with text, but it can also be achieved with different colors and shapes. It just depends on what the document calls for and what fits right, what feels right. So after hierarchy, we have unity. So unity is how well each element corresponds to one another in the document itself. So here we have a very simple logo. It just says Grandeur in a nice script font, and then below it, it says company in a nice sans serif font. And behind the primary lettering, we have this nice flourish and some sparkles. But if we do a little bit to change this, and we change the font type, we change that. And let's say we go with a regular. It doesn't have the same level of depth, it doesn't have the same level of emotion to it, and it doesn't achieve what the original design does. This is a lot more elegant. This feels more in line with high society and a more expensive taste. Whereas this is okay, but it doesn't achieve to the same level as the first one. So let's break it down a little bit. You've got light strokes here, where you see light strokes are matching up here as well as in this font itself. You then have these thick strokes that have a little bit more depth to them, and it feels very delicate. It's structured, but it still is delicate, it fits, and it feels a lot nicer than this chunky, clunky, where you have a, thick font up here and then really fine detailing down here and then a really skinny font, and it's just all sorts of mismatched styles. So Unity is one of the background elements that is one of the first things you'll notice when looking at a design. You'll say it doesn't feel right. Why doesn't it fit together? So it's like trying to put two puzzle pieces from two different boxes together. So it may kind of fit if you jam it in there, but it won't always be perfect. So next one we have is repetition. So repetition is utilizing the same visual element throughout the design. This creates a sense of consistency, a sense of familiarity. This can be done with typeface, graphical elements, patterns, colors. It's really what builds a theme into your designs. So here you see repetition through the use of these little heart figures. So it's not always the same heart figure. You may notice that this one on the top left is the same as the middle right, but at first glance, it's 6 different heart guys prepping for Valentine's Day. You then have the use of these little hearts throughout the entirety of the design, just sort of sprinkled all over the place. Same with these sparkles, creating a sense of repetition there. Then you look and say, well, what about the text? So the first text that we have is this nice sans serif font that is going every other line. And then we have a nice script font. So it's visually appealing. You see let's look back to hierarchy and say, oh, it's Valentine's Day, it's on February 14th, if you didn't know. Then you look at the smaller details and say, oh, there's a celebration at an address, and I can RSVP with Jennifer at this number on the screen. So using that hierarchy in combination with repetition, creating a very direct sense of how to best distribute your information to your audience. So after repetition, we have pattern. Now, repetition and pattern are very close together. They're not the same, but they're very close. So patterns, specifically, is repeating the multiple design elements, and it creates a consistent theme. So a good example of a pattern would say, let's look at a quilt. A quilt is built off a pattern or a knitted object or anything like that. The pattern is the design. However, in this, you want the pattern to be an aspect of your design and work for you. You don't want it to overtake your design, unless that's your intent. If your intent is for your entire piece of design work to be a pattern, that could fit. However, 90% of the time, if you have text and colors and layouts, you don't want the pattern to be overtaking everything else. It has to work for you. Looking specifically at this design shows New Year, New Hope, 2023. You see this curved pattern on the numbers right here, and it goes all the way around on every single number. You then look at the pattern of the way the colors are distributed. You could say, well, if 2023 was all in one color, it would still get the point across, but it would be less visually appealing. This creates a sense of depth. This creates a sense of emotion. It attaches each number to the next as they use the same teal, red, white, teal. And it's the same pattern for all 4 letters, right? So we're about 20 minutes in. I was planning on us being at the 30-minute mark right now, but I talk a little bit fast. So if you have any questions, feel free to ask them now, or if you need to take a breather, grab some water. If not, that's fine. We're about 10 minutes earlier than I expected us to be. So, all right. So the next one we have is rhythm, huh? Yeah. Well, yours was done in 17 minutes, wasn't it? 19 minutes. So I'm still doing a little bit better. I'm going to hear about that later. So rhythm. Rhythm, you look at this and maybe you say, well, this looks a lot like the pattern image or a lot like the repetition image. Like I said, a lot of overlap here. However, pattern uses a variation of the same elements. So while you may see rabbits, this is a lot like the Valentine's Day image, where the rabbits are very similar in nature, but they each have their own unique individualistic design. It creates a sense of flow, a sense of movement, and the background of this image creates a little bit of depth. And in a way, it does relate to the front of the image as well. So when you look, you see a bunch of circles with subsets of smaller circles inside of them. But when you them, they have this bouncing feeling to them, relating to the design. And I don't know if this was intentional of the designer or not, but this was the first thing that stuck out to me was, oh, that's kind of cool. So you have your similar elements, they have their variation. You do still have the same elements. So stars, can be difficult to have a bunch of unique different stars because it's such a universally recognizable shape. However, you do have them organized in different ways. You have your clouds up here and down here, they're just flipped horizontally, and then your variety of other clouds here. So I thought that was kind of neat, just having that sort of bouncing light feeling that matches the energy of the rabbits in the scene as well. So number 8, we have movement. So movement is another way to convey emotion, to convey urgency, and a sense of depth. So looking at this marathon poster, movement will bring this, it does bring this design to life. It feels like this runner is coming right at us through the various ways that they've used to create that sense of depth and urgency. So it's the aspect of taking it from a flat image and making it feel alive. Not necessarily three-dimensional, but it's introducing complexity without creating a sense of muddiness or lack of clarity. So if we tweak this design just a little bit, let's keep the runner, and let's tweak it just a tiny bit. This does not have the same feeling to it. And I think this is good, because this one is a marathon, and this one is a run and walk. It's a much shorter distance, and it's not as serious, it's not as high intensity, it's not as demanding as the marathon. So this would still be fine if you had run and walk. It would still do just as well. But this has a little bit more of a calming presence with it, with the warm purple. The path is a little bit more winding. It's in the middle of the race. It's not right at the finish line. So for this, I think it's just fine. But you can see that with the same or similar element, it creates two very different senses of emotion and urgency. So now let's analyze that first one and find out why it has that sense of urgency, that sense of depth. So the way they did this design, they have a city skyline in the background, and that helps create perspective, showing that it's coming from a single origin point. There's clouds in the background, which creates that sense of depth. Those are a lot further away than the city. And then we have speed lines up close showing this guy's moving really fast. And then they included their design, the ribbon right here at the end. So they have their text. You see the hierarchy, it's a marathon. It starts at 7:30, and then the details are right in the center. So this is our last principle. We're sitting at the 25-minute mark. This is variety. Variety is almost a subset of the contrast principle. So variety is creating contrast through the use of different shapes, images, typographic elements. So for this instance, you could say, well, look at this. It's starting with a serif font. We then shuffle down to a script font, then another serif font right here in the middle. It's kind of hard to see with the low resolution projector. And then we have high contrast in the colors right here of a blue background, a red foreground. You can see I was talking a little bit earlier about blurriness. The background is slightly out of focus compared to the crisp. Well, with this projector, nothing's crisp, but crisp logs and a fire, and that is obviously the focal point. That bonfire is what they want people to know about. You have your hierarchy, you have your depth, color, contrast. All right, so I lied. We don't have 9 principles. We have 10. This one's more of a bonus because color is not necessarily a principle per se. Color is something that accompanies everything else into creating your design as a whole. So like I've said, so many of these, I've said this almost about every single one of our principles, is that it ties everything together, it creates a theme, it creates emotion. Everything in your design has the capacity to create a sense of emotion and connectivity to the audience. And it's more a matter of if you want to convey a sense of emotion. You don't have to. It could be very generic and say, I don't really want anyone to feel anything when they look at this other than knowing when my event is. And that's just fine. For some events, that's perfectly fine. For a lot of our chamber chatter newsletters, they have nice flowing designs, very water-like, relaxing, not necessarily in your face crazy, but still an emotion nonetheless. So looking at the color of this has very warm tones. It fits that campfire aesthetic. But if we go in and change this color palette around just a little bit to Kenai chamber colors, suddenly it feels very retro. It feels a little bit more energetic. About, with the nighttime theme, maybe there's going to be some more fun activities other than just hanging out around a campfire, right? So creating colors can create very different emotions. And then this one is obviously a lot colder and not as warm as this first one. So looking at color specifically, there's a rule that they say it's a rule, but it's not really a requirement. It's called the 60-30-10 rule. And it is a distribution of colors over your design. So 9 times out of 10, if you use this sort of formula of your primary colors, one takes up 60% of the design, another takes up 30%, and another takes 10%. A lot of the time, you will have a very nice looking color palette. Now, you can expand that color palette out and say, 60% of my design is yellow, but I have 3 shades of yellow that are spread out over a couple of different things. That's fine. There's nothing wrong with even having a duotone design where it's just 2 different colors. It's really what fits for that design. If you want it to be, 2 very different colors, like an orange and purple for a Halloween theme or something like that, that's just fine. This is just a very basic rule that can be helpful if you're struggling with color management and aligning with color palettes and things like that. So following that, I do want to talk about attribution and etiquette in design. So how many folks so just out of curiosity, how many folks in here regularly create designs or posters or anything like that for your workplace? So on occasion, have you ever, let's say you're looking for a very specific element. Let's say you've Googled an image. Have you Googled an image and just copied and pasted that to your design? I've done that before too. Technically, we're supposed to attribute that. So 9 times out of 10, you need to look at where you're getting your stuff from and then attribute it if necessary. Now, there are other services like Canva is a really good one because everything inside of Canva, if it's in there, you don't have to attribute it because it's already being paid for. There's other services where if you're using it for free, you have to attribute it. And if you're paying for their subscription, you don't have to attribute it. So a good example of that would be this slideshow. I did not design any of these fun yellow, green, or yellow, blue, red graphics. I didn't make any of that. There's a website called SlidesGo, and you'll see on my last slide, there's an attribution there that created all of that as a really nice template for me. So attribution is very important. Now, the font that I'm using, specifically, this is a Google font. So if you didn't know, Google has a massive library of fonts. All of their fonts are open source. So open source means anyone can download the font, anyone can use it for free, anyone can edit this font, and they do not have to say where they got it from. They can, but they don't have to. There's no legal recourse for it. However, there are other websites, like Adobe has a lot of really cool fonts, but you got to pay for those. And if you don't hold an Adobe license, you have to attribute, or you can't even attribute, you have to pay for the font and then hold a license for it. It's a lot like software or something akin to that. So text. So really, font types, images, it all comes down to basically being plagiarism, right? If you're writing it off as your own without giving the proper recognition to whoever it came from, it equates to plagiarism. And there can be certain levels of copyright strikes. So this is one thing I tell folks. So if you work in a business and let's say you hire somebody to create a logo for you or create a design or a flyer or something for you, if they're including photos in that, let's say you just hired them off Fiverr or a freelance website where maybe they don't reside in the US or they're not in your state and they don't have any stock, but it's a cheap service, so you're paying for it. A lot of times they'll just use free photos off of Google if they're not well-versed in what needs to be attributed. So just something to be aware of. If you ever have anybody else doing your designs and you see a photo that you don't recognize, ask about it. because there can be legal recourse if the origin creator hears about it, there could be trouble. So, yep. So this is from the SlidesGo website. This is what I found on their site is if you are a free user, you must attribute to SlidesGo by keeping the slide. They have a specific credit slide right here at the end where that appears. So really, things like Canva are really nice because you don't have to attribute anything, and they got a bunch of photos. They hold a license with other stock photography companies such as FreePix, or there's a couple of other large ones that are out there that hold contracts with Canva. So now I do want to talk a little bit about some resources that I think helped me when I was going through my sort of creative learning process. These are all free, mostly free resources. YouTube is a massive, massive component of this. There are a ton of design resources out there. The last couple of days, I was just doing some digging, and I'll include this in a list that I email out tomorrow or on Monday. There was a video just on color use, and it was about 45 minutes long. Very in-depth. They have very hands-on examples, and they use different free to paid softwares that they have a very specific workflow that they show you how to get good colors, what colors work together, and really talks about color theory. This also goes into the use of typography, the use of repetition and hierarchy, and really everything that I've talked about today. There is a massive amount of information out on YouTube that is free to view. So what I'll do is I have a curated list of stuff that I will send out over email that if folks have any general interest in, that'll be available. And it's about 4 or 5 hours of content total. I tried paring it down, but there's just a couple of really good ones in there that I couldn't. So next website is defont.com. Sounds really silly, really powerful resource. Defont.com is a website that has a bunch of free to use fonts that you can download and use in your designs. If you're using a software like Canva, I don't know if you can do this in the free version. I know if you pay for Canva Pro, you can upload your own fonts. So if you're looking through that entire list and there's nothing there that you like, Defont is a really good website for it. And they have an options menu where you can choose what level of attribution you want. So they have 100% free with 0 attribution to free for personal use or free with attribution. So a lot of really good display fonts are there. So those are the very specific ones where maybe it looks like it's out of a Dr. Seuss book, or it's Harry Potter related, or anything like that. So Defont, one of my favorite websites. Can't recommend it high enough. You just got to do a little bit digging. So now if you're doing designs outside and you're using another third-party software, Vecteezy is a really good place to get graphics that look like this up on the top right-hand side of the screen, where it's free with a certain level of attribution most times, or you can pay for a license and you don't have to do any sort of attribution. So Font Awesome is actually a directory that a lot of websites use to create icons for certain things. And so if you're looking for a very specific icon, so I had earlier in my slides, I can maybe go back a little bit later, they're just very clean looking icons. They have a massive library and you can download them in a vector or a raster format such as JPEG or PNG, and you can use all of those in your design. So we use those when we created the maps for the Kenai River Marathon. We use Font Awesome on the Kenai River Marathon website here at the Chamber. We use them on our Chamber website. I use them almost everywhere that I'm doing any type of design and I need a really good crisp icon. So ranging from 2 business people having a meeting to toxic waste symbol to briefcase, they've got probably 10,000 icons in the library, if not more. So Font Awesome is a really, really good resource. Now, talk a little bit about softwares. So Adobe is probably the biggest name that comes to people's mind when they think design software. You have Photoshop, you have Illustrator, you have Lightroom, which is for photo editing, and they have an entire suite of other tools for other purposes. Adobe is the industry standard for design right now. The downside is it has a very, very large learning curve. If you don't have any training in it, it can be very daunting, very daunting. There is a lot of YouTube resources, but for Adobe, you're also paying $30+ a month. So unless your institution or organization already pays for it, it can be a steep price if you don't have any experience in that. So Affinity is a competitor to Adobe that showed up in the last 2 or 3 years. So Affinity is a standalone cost, and it has 3 separate softwares that come with that. There is Affinity Designer, which competes with Adobe's Illustrator. There's Affinity Photo, which competes with Photoshop and Lightroom. And then there's Affinity Publisher. Affinity Publisher is currently the software that we are using to redesign our visitor's guide. It competes with Adobe's InDesign. It competes with Microsoft's Publisher. And you can get all 3 of those for less than $200, and you have the license as long as you want. You don't have to pay another subscription. It's yours. So I use it for all of my personal design work. They do run sales fairly frequently where they'll do 50% off or 30% off. And it's a really nice software for just sort of getting into design without having a massive, monthly cost. So it is a little bit steeper up front, but it's 3 really good softwares that I think have a lot of potential. Yeah.
I have a question. So Affinity, would that be more, because you mentioned Adobe just having that, you have to get pretty involved in the learning curve. Is Affinity going to be more something that's user-friendly and you can kind of jump in?
So Affinity is similar to the Adobe side of things where there is a little bit of a learning curve. However, they do have a really good community presence. So when I was looking at Affinity as my first sort of view of the software, they have a lot of good resources on YouTube. They have a good community, but then the folks within the company as well have created a lot of really good videos and documentation on how to do things. So when I was first looking at it, I spent a good 2 or 3 days just watching all of their videos to see what I could do in the software. And it ranges pretty drastically. The really cool thing with both Adobe and Affinity is because all of their softwares are made by the same company, they talk to each other. So when I'm working on our visitor's guide right now, and I pull a graphic in that I've designed, I can modify it directly in the publisher software. I don't have to go to another software, save it, and then re-pull it into the publisher. It's just right there. I can change it and save it right there. So there's a lot of documentation. However, again, another learning curve. I would not say it's as steep as Adobe, but the big reason for that is because Affinity does not offer as many complex tasks as Adobe. So Adobe's Illustrator, for example, has probably 2 or 3 times the amount of functions in terms of different ways that you can design things. You can achieve the same end result, you just have to go about it 2 different ways, because Adobe's had time to create an automated process where it pulls up a little box and says, what do you want to do here? And you pull a couple sliders, check a couple boxes, hit OK, and you're done. Affinity, you may have to be a little more hands-on with it. So it just depends on how deep you want to go with it. Affinity Designer is primarily a vector-based design tool. So if you're doing logos or stickers or anything like that, that's what that'll be for. And then you can migrate that over to the photo side if you need it to be in a JPEG or a PNG or rasterized. So short answer, they both have a learning curve. This one I think is a lot easier because they have a really strong community engagement. However, Adobe's been around for 20 plus years. So there's a lot of pros and cons to each of those. So if anyone has any questions specifically about Affinity, we can chat after, because I can't get enough of it. So, and I definitely love talking about this kind of stuff. So those are the paid softwares. There are 2 softwares that are free to use. GIMP on the left does Photoshop level work on raster images. And then Inkscape does vector design. 2 very big downsides to these softwares is they are open source, which means anyone can modify them, which is a good and a bad thing. In the 3D design community, there's a company called Blender. Blender makes a 3D design tool that is very quickly outpacing a lot of the industry standards that cost thousands of dollars to attain a license for. Blender is a really good example of open source doing a really good job at pulling in from everyone in the community. Inkscape and GIMP are lacking in a few different things. So if you look at Affinity and Adobe, let's say Adobe's been around for 20 years and Affinity's been around for 5 or 10 years. Affinity does not have the same level of resources as Adobe. They don't have the same level of features. Even more so, Inkscape is the same to Affinity in that sense, where Inkscape does not have the same amount of predefined features that Affinity does. So they're free to use. They're not as easy to use though. So really just depends on how deep you want to get into the design stuff. If you're not really looking at creating your own vector graphics, you may not even need to worry about jumping into Inkscape or Affinity Designer, and Canva might be the right place. I mean, I use Canva when I need something done right now. As much as I love creating my own graphics, if it's more efficient to have a pre-done template and I just need to have an announcement put out, I'll just do it in Canva. But if I have something very specific like our visitor's guide where I want to invest a lot more time into it because it's going to be more widely distributed and it will be around for a lot longer, that's where I start paying more attention to the detail and I want to invest more time into it. So really it comes down to how much time do you want to invest and is it necessary? Because Affinity, Adobe, GIMP, and Inkscape are not always the right fit for people, you know? If you don't have any interest of learning the very deep nuances of everything, you don't have to, because Canva is a free tool and their pro subscription is a lot cheaper than Adobe's pro subscription. So you just got to sort of pick which route you want to go down, try a couple things out, and you know, that's how it goes. There's another software I recently found called Kittle, which does a lot of the same things as Canva. However, they do have a paid feature to it. So Kittle does a lot of the same has a lot of the same resources, but it goes a little bit more in depth. So it's sort of a stepping stone between Canva and these larger 4 softwares, where Kittle allows you to get a little bit more in the weeds, a little bit more in depth, but there's a little bit of a cost to it. So I believe they offer a 14-day free trial or a 7-day free trial, and they've been around not as long as Canva, but they're doing a lot of really cool things. So yeah, I'd say take with that what you will. And really, that is all I had for today. Here you see the credits. These 2 on the top are curated by SlidesGo, and then all of my design examples came from Canva or Kittle. Those were all pre-made by other designers. I didn't make any of it. So really, a lot of this, I just made the text, 90% of it. However, with that, does anybody have any questions, any comments? Yeah.
What did you say a flourish was again?
So the question for the folks on Zoom was, what is a flourish? So a flourish, let's go back up to, I believe it was in Unity, maybe. Well, nope, definitely not Unity. No, it'll fit here. So Unity, so looking at a flourish. So a flourish is really just a stroke that comes off of really anything. So for a font specifically, it could be this big chunky, you know, serif off of the V. And it's really just an over-exaggeration. So if you think of writing in cursive, if you have anyone who does, you know, large calligraphy or hand-drawn scripts or anything like that, you may see a lot more flourishes off of that. And it's really nothing that contributes to the text itself. It's more of an ornamental detail. So any other questions? So we do have a Canva class coming up. Sam, do you remember which month that is? So on our website, we have a calendar. On that calendar, we have all of our other business lecture series. Sam is going to be teaching a class on Canva basics, as she spends a lot more time in Canva than I do. So if you want to learn more about hands-on design and things like that, be sure to check out that calendar for the Canva basics. And that'll be, sorry? June. So I say design in depth, but it's Canva specific. So if you're looking to learn about any of the other design softwares, that won't be the place for it. But there will be a lot, that'll be focusing a lot on Canva features, Canva tips and tricks, a lot of the preset effects and things they have for that. And that will be in June. So with that, if you guys don't have any other questions, I think we're good to go. You want me to show examples of my work? Okay, give me just a second. Sam's taking me off script. All right, just give me a minute or 2, and I will pull up some examples of my work, if I can find it.
I feel like he didn't give himself enough credit for what he actually does, because he actually has his own design company outside of this.
Let's see if I can.
Not to embarrass you, and he actually has designed video game content. Like, there's actually, just because he didn't create this, which I feel like you kind of poo-pooed yourself almost, but he is like actually has really great work. So that's why I'm making him do this. Because I'm like, where's your stuff?
I don't know if I have. Oh, here we go. Maybe, I don't know. I have a lot of my stuff in a lot of different places. Um,
Not to be on the spot. I guess I should have asked if you had that
Yeah,
ready.
we could just take this moment to really kind of show you, you designed this within like a week of working here. Our Kenai sticker that we love.
I do a lot of very different stuff. So in terms of like drawing and sketching, this is a really, let's see, I gotta see if this is gonna come through on the Zoom. This is a really fun one that I did. That's coming through on the Zoom? Okay, perfect. I don't know, oh no, a friend had recommended this to me. That was a sticker that I made probably about 3 years ago. I haven't done a lot of sketching or drawing in that regard recently. There is a local company that is called Crave Alaska Cabins, and they're located out in Sterling. I created their website.
So when you start on something like this,
Mhm.
are you doing it on the computer? Or are you doing it on physical paper sketches, paper and pen? How do you start with something like that?
So my workflow has really changed over time. So about 3 years ago, I got an iPad Pro, and there's an app called Procreate, which is a digital drawing application. So what I used to do is I used to do everything by hand, and then I would copy it to the computer, and I had a separate drawing pad that was about $60 that I would then draw it on the computer. So I'd be drawing down here, and I'd be looking up here. With the iPad, I can look at the screen and draw on the screen directly. So I would typically sketch it, and then what an illustrator would do with, let's say, inking with a pen, I would effectively do the same thing, but digitally. So a lot of this is hand-drawn and then brought into the computer and colored and done with different line strokes and things like that. And then for this website is still in development, so I don't know. It might be, let's see if it'll. So this is still in development. All of these assets are hand created. These are all done in Affinity's designer software. And this is this is more in a very vectorized, clean cut style that the owner really liked. This is very close to the way that Google does a lot of their designs, where everything's very simple. There's a lot of very crisp edges and lines. And this is the company owner's cabin that's his flagship cabin that he designs and then customizes and sells to the client themselves. I wish I had prepped some of our visitor guide designs.
Oh, yeah.
We've got a couple of new visitor guide designs that are a lot of fun.
Should be out by May.
Should be out by May. Mm.
Do you do WordPress?
I do WordPress specifically for the chamber. Up until I had moved into this job, my experience in WordPress was very minimal. However, I have dabbled in a lot of different website design tools. So to an extent, yes. It just depends on the site itself. So some of our websites are purely WordPress. So our Kenai River Marathon website is just WordPress, whereas the, let's say, Kenai Silver Salmon Derby or the I Love Kenai website, those are WordPress, but then they have an additional plugin that assists in the creation of it. So WordPress plugins are a new thing for me just because they're so specific. We just sort of inherited those when we took over those websites. And so, yeah. Did you have a WordPress specific question or?
My work uses WordPress, but I'm more familiar with Wix.
Yeah.
So I didn't know, maybe you can class on WordPress.
So that one of the questions at the end of this is always, what other opportunities would you like to have? Same as when we did the public speaking, we asked, what kind of, do you want classes or workshops or something else after? The same questions will be on the questionnaire when it comes back out to you guys. Would you like a workshop? Would you like something more in depth? Is there specific software that you'd like training on? Because some of those we could provide, and some of them we might just be able to give you resources for.
Right.
So, well, when we send out a survey, we actually only got, I think, 3 surveys back from public speaking, which is funny. Because I got a lot of great input verbally, but I didn't get a lot back through the surveys, which is always, funny because that's how we pull what we're gonna do. So,
Right.
because I can only remember so much everywhere. But so we'll send that survey out, and if you could fill it out and just let us know if there's something specific, like a WordPress class. I'm not opposed, and in fact, that's kind of, what we're trying to look into for 2025. We have 2024 classes already. So where can we go from there? And then same with like the last one, we're talking about getting a Toastmaster started, that's what these are for, is to continue that community development and figure out where we're gonna go with this, because it has been very well received.
Yeah, really.
Trying to pull more stuff up, but a lot of it's on my personal account, and this Chromebook does not like the fact that I'm trying to sign in multiple Google accounts.
That Chromebook doesn't like
Nope. Yep. This is very true. Cooperate.
Do you have some kind of thumbnail input? Because obviously the things that people do mostly are poster, a card, basically postcard is what I think of.
Yeah.
Is it best to limit it to a certain number of things? You did the priority thing.
Right.
These are all listed as 2 things. Or
So-
just kind of thumbnail.
So I think it really does depend on the context of what you're designing. So if it's an informational flyer, what I recommend to folks is if you have too much information, sometimes it can detract from what you're trying to achieve. So if you have that information already listed on a website or a Facebook event or anything like that, where they can go directly to that, a lot of times what I recommend is just including a link to that or a QR code. So for instance, the Kenai River Marathon, we just finished our poster for that. I don't know if I actually have that here currently. And so what we did for that was we included very basic things. Name of the event, time it starts, and then any contact information for questions, and then a QR code for the race website itself. So it really,
How does a person get a QR code for things?
so there are websites you can just search up QR code maker. And so a lot of those, some of those require you to have a login, some do not. If you have a Google email, any email address, you can sign up for it, and it's totally free, where it says, what's your link? You put your link in, you then click a button and it'll download it as a JPEG or a PNG image. So my recommendation when folks do those, I always tell people, test it first. Test it before you print, because sometimes that link will be funky or maybe it won't work, and it's hardly ever that happens. But I've had it happen to me before, where maybe I was doing multiple different things at once and I accidentally copied the wrong link that I was trying to send to a colleague or something like that, where it's a different website than I was intending to. So I recommend folks to test your QR codes before you print them.
And I've heard that it's important to have good contrast with those, because some people like to get creative and
Yeah.
make it kind of gray.
So QR codes are,
Read.
yeah. So QR codes, you can really change any of the colors as long as the core code is there. My preference, I just always prefer a black and white code just because it's the easiest to read. I know it's always going to work. Maybe Samantha's phone doesn't read codes the same as my phone does, or maybe someone, it's not the same clarity, whatever it may be. So my recommendation is always just, pick the 2 colors, the black and white.
And Canva did start offering these fancy
Oh, really?
QR codes that you can make that actually have designs in the QR codes. I do not recommend those any way, shape, or form, because again, there's some things that you just want simple.
Yeah.
And I feel like it doesn't take away from the design. Like, everyone knows what a QR code is for the most part. When you start integrating it into the design work of a paper, then you can lose that. Like, it might be more confusing because it's just this, like, some of them are like swirly. I don't know if you saw that yet, but it's weird. I was like, I don't know. But maybe that's just me too, being so used to something.
Well, I think a lot of
Eventually,
them,
all of them will be like that.
I think a lot of them use, I think they use AI to create those as well, where have a base image and then use AI to sort of enhance that or create a specific design for it. This is another logo I designed for a local company a few months back. So this is a very different type of logo as compared to some of the other stuff that I've done. So this one specifically, oh, if you can see, there's a lot going on here. And this is the struggle, and maybe not the bane of every designer's existence, but a struggle nonetheless, is meeting client expectations while still trying to have a good image at the end. Because if this were my business, I would have done something completely different, just because I have a very different taste, and this isn't my taste. But this is explicitly what the client wanted. Very specific desire to have this. Yes?
Can I ask about the inclusion of the 4-leaf clovers?
So the owner is from Ireland. So that was just a little bit of his personal background. He is from Ireland, but he is a very patriotic American, thus the little American flag right here. But he is Irish, and so when you speak to him, first time you meet him, you know instantly. Very thick accent, very strong accent, but that was sort of his preference there. This is a combination of vector and raster designs. So if you'll notice, he's based on the Kenai Peninsula via the inclusion of Mount Redoubt in the background. These are the 3 sets of equipment that he offers. And then all of this is done in a vector environment. However, when you look at the colors of the trees, ranging from the white green or the leaves going from dark green to light green, those are gradients. Gradients do not transfer in vector graphics, which means that when I exported this, I had to export this in a massive, massive, massive resolution, higher than what would typically be seen as a 4K resolution. So most images that you see on your computer are, your computer monitors, most of them are 1090 pixels, or sorry, 1080 pixels, 1080p wide. This one was about 6,000 to 8,000 pixels wide, which means that if you were to pull it up, you'd have to zoom way out, and it would take a pretty decent time to download. So the reason I did that is because he was getting this printed on the side of his truck. And as I said before, if you're doing something large, you want it to be a vector. Because of his specific requests and requirements, we had to make it rastered. We had to make it rastered. Even with the massive resolution, the way that I don't believe his printer printed it the best he could, personally. When you walk up to the side of his truck, you can see pixels. He doesn't have a problem with it. It hurts me. But he doesn't have a problem with it, and when you're at a distance, it still looks just as good as this.
Take a Sharpie. It's all colors.
But there are, when you get to a certain level in here, it's very crisp from a distance, but you still see there are pixel lines right here. So when you get up close to the truck, because it's about this wide, you do see individual pixels. But if you're 5 feet or more away, it looks great. So yeah, designing has, yeah, I've done a lot of very, 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 very different designs. So.
We can tell you love elastic.
Oh yeah.
Comes through.
Yeah. Awesome. Well, if nobody has any more questions, we're sitting right at 1 o'clock. And I think we'll stop the recording for the Zoom there. And then tomorrow or Monday, depending on what else we have out. So we'll just send it to the email that was